Wonderful. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We're very excited to welcome you to the day one of the APRU climate change simulation, and a warm welcome to the facilitators and guest speakers who are joining us for today. Thank you for all of the care that you've taken with your individual reflections and your group work. Today we have 2 plenary speakers, and then we'll go into our 3 different breakout rooms for the negotiations. You can see the schedule on the screen here. That includes both some small group negotiations within your color delegation within those rooms, an opportunity to review the pledges that we've made. We will hear from our UN Secretary for the Climate, who's going to help us interpret what's coming out of the simulation. And then there'll be more opportunity for discussion and negotiation between rooms. In each of your rooms, there will be a moderator that will help you move from activity to activity within that. There's a couple of reminders that I want to give you. One is I see many of you have already put your Zoom background with your flag or your map on your Zoom background. Please do that, especially when we go into the breakout rooms and do the negotiation. It's very helpful to have that symbol. The other change that you can do is to rename yourself with your designation on your name. So I've put UN Secretary General by my name, so that you know that that's the role that I'll be playing when we go into our small breakout rooms. If at any time you have a question today, you have a question about logistics, or you have a question for our speakers, please put those into the chat and we'll either respond to them if it's a logistic question in the chat, or if it's for our speakers, we'll save those questions and ask them during a question and answer time like we did last time we were together. And Tina, if you can move to the next slide. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rhys Jones. Ngāti Kuhununu is a public health physician and senior lecturer in the Maori Health at the University of Auckland, Aotearoa, New Zealand. His research addresses Indigenous health and health equity, with a particular focus on environmental influences on Maori health and well-being. He is a passionate advocate for action on the social determinants of health, equity, and Indigenous rights. Rhys was the founding co-convener of Aotearoa, the New Zealand Climate and Health Council, a health professional organization focusing on the health challenges of climate change and the health opportunities of climate action. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat during the speech, and you are in for an absolute treat. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jones.
Kia ora, thank you very much. Yeah, it's great to have the opportunity to speak with you today, this morning / afternoon / evening, wherever you happen to be. Nō reira ko wai tēnei, ko Rhys Jones tōku ingoa, heri no Ngāti Kahungunu, nō reira ka nui te mihi ki a koutou. So that's just me saying very briefly where I'm from, as was mentioned in the introduction. I'm from a tribal grouping called Ngāti Kahungunu, which is on the east coast of the North Island of New Zealand. And it's great to see actually everyone's flags and things. I like that as a way of just identifying where people are from. In my background, I've got here my, if I move to the side, my maunga or mountain in the background, which is one of the key identifying features that we use as Māori Indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand, to sort of identify where we're from and indicate a place of belonging. So I'm going to share my screen now and just, move into talking with you about climate action, really. And, you know, as was mentioned in the introduction, I'm coming at this very much from a health perspective, from an Indigenous health equity perspective, as a public health physician, but as someone who's also been quite heavily involved in advocacy and action around climate change, climate health, climate justice. So I really want to talk today about this idea of climate action needing to move from a very narrow focus on just reducing emissions to a much broader kind of endeavor, which is around decolonizing and actually trying to break down some of the systems that are responsible for creating the things that have led to climate change. So hopefully I'll talk a little bit more about those things as we go through, but really just to kind of make the point that we seem to be living in an era of overlapping crises. And obviously, you know, we're all familiar with the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, but really I think that's just almost a warm-up or a you know, a much smaller kind of crisis in terms of some of the things that we need to be prepared for coming along. And some of the ecological crises like climate change is one indicator of that, are really also potentially just symptoms of an underlying problem. And that is around the way we engage with each other, with the environment, with the broader natural world around us. And those issues are to do with really systems like colonialism, capitalism, that are driving a lot of the problems that we're seeing with climate change and with other ecological crises. So I quite like this, this article, in fact, and this particular idea from it, which is, you know, it says the ecocidal logics that now govern our world are not inevitable or human nature, but are the result of a series of decisions that have their origins and reverberations in colonization. So this is by some Indigenous scholars in North America, and really points to the idea that these things that we're seeing now are not new. It's not just since we kind of started digging up fossil fuels and started burning those things and emitting greenhouse gases. It's about going right back, you know, a history of 500 years or so, where our relationships with each other and with the natural world have really been corrupted from what those kind of original human ways of engaging were prior to that. And so what we're seeing now is that, sorry, the modern sort of way of being is about a fundamental separation of humans from each other and from the rest of nature. We've moved very much from a way of understanding in which everything is connected and everything is linked. And that's very much the way Indigenous people still see our relationships with each other and with the natural world. But in terms of our dominant, you know, Western colonial systems, we've moved to a way of understanding things that sees humans as separate from each other and tries to create divisions amongst different human populations, and also divisions between us and the rest of nature, so that we're somehow seen as existing either in a way that's superior to, or at least removed from the broader environment and natural world. And that has a series of, you know, really important implications, and one of which is, you know, climate change. And one of the really key things about climate change is the way in which it's, you know, and it's characterized by inequality at its heart. And this map here tries to show the difference between who's been responsible for the problem of climate change and who's experiencing the worst impacts. So on the top, we have the map of the world, which is distorted according to the relative contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. And we can see that North America and Europe, unsurprisingly, are blowing up relative to their usual size on a world map. So those are the places that are obviously responsible for having emitted the most greenhouse gases. And yet when we look at climate change deaths and the predicted health impacts of climate change, we see those are pretty much, you know, exclusively, at least in the short term, born in Africa and the subcontinent, so India. And so the people who have contributed least to climate change are going to experience the worst impacts, and in fact already are, and vice versa. So incredibly inequitable situation, and that's because of the way those human relationships have been created to put certain populations above others. And so we're now in a situation where we've reached a point of real urgency, and in fact many would say we reached that a long time ago, and that we should have been acting with greater urgency decades ago. But let's leave that to one side. We're now at a point where, yeah, we have to act quickly, and scientists are becoming increasingly frustrated with policymakers and governments and industry, etc., who are not necessarily taking up the challenge to decarbonize and to address climate change in the way we should, and with the urgency we should. And even when we do start tackling climate change, I'm going back to my original point here, that we focus very much on the superficial aspects of it. We see it as largely as a problem of too many greenhouse gases being emitted into the atmosphere. And this example here is something that's just come out recently, about a month ago here in New Zealand, which is our first emissions reduction plan. It's part of our climate change legislation, which mandates effectively a zero net emissions by the year 2050, and has a plan to get there. But when we look at it, we see a lot of the policies are sort of very much just more or less a greener version of the status quo, is the way I like to describe it. And we're not really tackling the heart of the problem. So this is one example from the transport sector, where we see a lot of the policies really emphasizing a shift from internal combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles. And we can see, yeah, obviously that's potentially quite good for greenhouse gas emissions, but it leaves all the other problems associated with a car dominant and a car dependent society unsolved. And so, we have a very similar looking picture in terms of our overall transport sector, but just using a different kind of fuel. And what that also doesn't really address is a lot of the other hidden inequities that are behind that. So a shift to electric vehicles doesn't address any of the major inequities in our transport system, or the health inequities that result from that. It also potentially creates a whole lot of new challenges and problems involved with producing batteries for this massive fleet of electric vehicles that we're going to need to transition to. And effectively, the way I see it and the way I look at it is really just shifting from one form of sort of extractive capitalism to a different form of extractive capitalism. Okay, maybe shift from fossil fuels to electric vehicles and batteries, but that in itself creates these issues with environmental degradation for the mining, human rights abuses in many of the countries where the minerals are extracted from for batteries, all those sorts of things. So we're not really actually changing a lot to do with the systemic structural issues. We're just tinkering with the kinds of fuels that we're using to power our society. And in many ways, I see that as we're trying to solve the problem of climate change from within the same ideological and theoretical systems that created it in the first place. So, if we stop seeing climate change as just a problem of too many emissions and actually see it as a problem of colonialism and capitalism, then it's clear that solutions created within those frameworks are not actually addressing the problem. They're just giving us perhaps a slightly greener version of the status quo. And so my key point really is that we need to look to other ways of engaging with and understanding and being in the world. And Indigenous knowledges, values, and ways of being provide an alternative to Western colonial capitalist ways of doing things. And so if we privilege Indigenous knowledges and around a range of things around environmental management, food production, transport, housing. There's a range of different areas. If we do that and support Indigenous self-determination, that can actually fundamentally change systems and provide that foundation for really meaningful change rather than just superficial change. And so I'm working on this model of climate justice where we need to think about things and the idea of justice in much broader terms than we previously have. And because often we tend to think about things in climate justice really just as, are workers going to have a place to go if they're leaving fossil fuel industries, for example? Are the price mechanisms going to be equitable, or do we need to change things to make it better for low-income communities? But we need to think much broader than just those distributive impacts and think about procedural justice. So, are the right people involved, or is it the same old suspects? Relational justice around how we acknowledge our relations, including non-human relations. Recognition justice, so that's about whose knowledges and understandings are recognised and whose aren't. And restorative justice, actually working to address some of the historical harms and trauma that has been done, for example, through the process of colonisation. And recognising that this all happens in a context, a historical context, and a context in which certain people don't have the ability to have their voices heard in society to the extent that others do. So that's a pretty complex thing, but it's to get us to understand that we can't just think about equity and justice in narrow terms. And just something to really leave us with here, I think, is that we need to think about, when we're thinking about climate action, dismantling the systems that are causing the problems and that are responsible for the situation we find ourselves in, but also rebuilding new systems. And so I really like this idea from Ruha Benjamin, which is around being able to craft the worlds that we can't live without. And from an Indigenous perspective, I sort of shared some of those ideas about Indigenous knowledges and self-determination, just as we dismantle the worlds that we cannot live within, which I see the current dominant sort of systems as being. So just to summarize really quickly, because I'm aware I'm probably over time, is that climate change is not just about too many greenhouse gas emissions and disruption of our atmosphere because of that. It's a symptom of severed relationships, essentially. It's about those fundamental relationships that we had with each other and with the natural world around us that allowed us to live and thrive for millennia in a really kind of balanced and reciprocal way, having been severed through the process of colonization, colonialism, capitalism, and in the modern kind of state of things, we now exist in a really unbalanced setting where those relationships have been disrupted and need to be renewed and restored. And so to do that, I think we've really got to think about rejecting solutions that just uphold the systems that are responsible for the problem in the first place. So yeah, shifting to a different kind of fuel for our cars might be good in terms of emissions, but really doesn't address some of the underlying environmental, human rights and other, systemic issues. So we've got to centre environmental justice, and as I mentioned, think about justice very broadly, and really kind of move forward with the idea of decolonisation, not just decarbonisation. And that means reinstituting Indigenous ways of knowing, doing and being. And to do that, we must have Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination to be able to achieve that. So that's all I have. I'm hoping there's time for a few questions and things, but I really appreciate your time today. Kia ora tātou.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Jones. Join me in clapping. Are there questions? Tina, I wonder if you can make it again so I can see the whole audience. Students, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. Let me start with the first question that came in, which is what can we do to promote more Indigenous knowledge sharing?
Yeah, and that is a very good question, and it depends a little bit, and I think it will vary by where you happen to be, and in terms of who the Indigenous peoples are and what the history is there, and but in many places where there has been experiences of colonization, we've seen disruption to Indigenous knowledges, but having said that, there has been processes to continue that knowledge transmission. And so we do see those things actually, particularly in the last decade or two, a lot of revitalization of those kind of knowledge transmission, particularly our younger generations getting into trying to reinvigorate knowledges, trying to recover things that may have been lost along the way or buried back in historical times. And so I think anything that we can do to support those processes, so investment in Indigenous language revitalization, investment in Indigenous educational strategies and educational institutions to be able to restore that, but also recognizing that those knowledges are there and creating that recognition of those within policy processes, within sort of our standard decision-making processes that often really only value one way of knowing often, and often Western knowledge and scientific evidence and things is seen as the gold standard, and other forms of knowledge are not recognized to anywhere near the same extent. So it's about creating a way of recognizing often quite different systems of knowledge and how they can complement each other, and how Indigenous knowledges can inform our approach to not just climate change, but many other issues as well.
Great, thank you. Here's another question kind of in the same vein, but it's focusing on the role that academia has in the climate crisis and climate action, and how can we bring traditional ecological knowledge and environmental justice discourse into academic spaces?
Yeah, so I think similarly, it's about creating space for Indigenous knowledges, and which is something we don't tend to do very well in academia, at least from my experience. And having worked in a university now for 20 years or so, it is a constant challenge to have recognition of Indigenous knowledges, just because our institutions don't have a history of that, or a way of reconciling those ways of knowing and doing and being in those systems of knowledge alongside the more conventional Western forms of knowledge. And so I think it's about all of us being able to make space for the different ways of knowing, trying to recognize that even if we don't necessarily have a deep understanding of those systems ourselves, we need to recognize them as valid and as legitimate in their own right. And also, I think a key thing is to create the space, but also support institutional change to create more Indigenous scholars, to really enhance the capacity of the Indigenous workforce, academic workforce, and do everything we can to create structural change to make not just to increase the numbers, but to actually make universities and academia a safe space for Indigenous peoples to engage in. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I think there are more questions that have come in, and if you're okay with it, maybe I'll email you the questions to kind of have you think about some answers. But I think that the one I want to pick is, could you explain how and that we have colonization today? And the writer says, I'm just trying to make sense of this term and what it means for our lives today.
Oh, sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, will you explain what, I think the question is, what is colonization and how is what does that mean today in 2022?
That's a really big question. And I mean, it's complex in a way in that colonization has taken different forms in different parts of the globe and in different regions around the world. But a lot of what we see, and speaking from our experience in a country like New Zealand, which also applies in similar ways to other countries like Australia and Canada, the US, and other sort of similar countries, is a history of settler colonialism where we have colonizers who have come into the country and effectively taken over. And so in that context, you know, colonization is about really changing the systems of governance, of knowledge, of everything to reflect the sort of the Western colonial reality, or the, you know, the systems and structures of the colonizing entity. And in that process, you know, really rejecting and replacing those indigenous systems that existed and that you know, had been built up over many, many centuries to be consistent with the land and the place that we were living in. And so really, when I talk about colonization, it's about seeing it as an ongoing process. So it's about the way those ways of thinking and doing and being have become normalized and, you know, continue to dominate our political decision making and our governance and systems across all of society. And so decolonization is partly about understanding how those ideological systems are still, you know, influencing the way in which we're doing things and contributing to problems like climate change, and trying to dismantle and sort of disinvest from those systems, while at the same time trying to rebuild indigenous ways of doing things. And some of the things that we were just talking about with revitalizing indigenous knowledges and having those be able to be recognized within our governance and decision-making processes.
Great. Thank you for such thorough responses and for really taking these different angles to the student questions. There's some other ones about what can we actually do and cars and simulations. I will send them to you so you can see the breadth of the questions. And students, I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of the questions today. Thank you. Thank you again, Dr. Jones, for being with us. And
Thanks,
now I'll turn it over to Melissa.
Hi, everyone. Great to see you all. Thank you again, Dr. Jones, for being part of this. And now we are going to move on to our second speaker for today. So it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Ralph Chammy, who's an assistant director at the IMF. He's currently on sabbatical from the IMF, working on tackling the two risks to humanity: climate change and biodiversity loss. He has developed a model for valuing natural capital, including blue and green nature, flora and fauna, and a framework for developing the natural capital markets for ecosystem services. An expert on fragile and low and middle income states, he's the co-founder of the Blue-Green Future and Rebalance Earth, and he's on the advisory boards of Geneva Macro Labs, Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association, and the EU Mediterranean and African Network for Economic Studies. He's also a senior finance advisor at Finance for Biodiversity Initiative, F4B. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Chammy for today.
Thank you, Melissa. It's wonderful to be involved in this project. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. So should I share my screen or is it going to be managed from your side, just so that I know?
It looks like Tina has the slides up if you.
Okay. Doesn't matter, as long
Okay.
whatever is more comfortable. I'm happy to. So should I?
I will share it for you. Just let me know.
Okay, so
if you are
so
going
then
to
I'll
the
just
next
say
slide.
next. Is this how we're going to do it? Okay, all right. So just what I would like to talk about today is I can already see something happening with my slide. Okay, how do we develop? Why should we develop? Why should we move away from our current economic system? And I'm glad that I came after Professor Rees because I'm very sympathetic to the point that our system that we have right now is has a lot of problems and is playing a big role in how we arrive at this calamity. But having been at COP26 and at Stockholm 50 myself, it has finally dawned on everyone that the world is facing. Can we stay with the first slide, please? Thank you. That we are facing not one calamity, which is climate change, but actually we're facing potential of another risk, which is the loss of nature and its biodiversity. And so we are facing actually dual risks. Can we stay with the first slide, please? Thank you. All right. So, and we're facing dual risk. And if any of these two risks were to materialize, our own existence on this planet is at risk. So it's not only a climate risk that we are facing, but we're also the loss of nature itself. And so because these two risks are happening at the same time, in order for us to mitigate those risks, we need to tackle them both at the same time. We cannot tackle one without the other. We just don't have time to do so. So the question is, what is it that we can do in order to mitigate both risks? And what I want to show you is that by going through the focusing on nature itself, we can perhaps reduce the risk to nature itself, and then nature can boomerang back to us by helping us to reduce climate risk. Now, the secret to all of this is what we already know, is that both risks are due to the fact of the human activity. Both are linked through our own behavior. Our own behavior is causing the climate calamity, and our own behavior is causing the risk to a loss of biodiversity and the death of many species and nature itself. So in order to solve the problem, we just have to change our own behavior. Question is, how are we going to do so? Well, in order to figure out how to solve the problem, you have to ask yourself, how did we arrive at this problem? And Professor Jones already gave us a number of ideas as to why we are in this situation. And I'm going to tackle it just from a different angle. So next slide, please.
Dr. Chami, can we have you run your own slides? They keep advancing. So maybe it's better to have you do it, and then that way.
I know, because I got dizzy myself. So.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. That's okay. Here, let's see. Okay. Are you able to see it?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, very good. Okay. All right. So let me stop this. All right. Here we go. So I just spoke about the two twin risks that we are facing, and that these twin risks are due to the behavior, to human activity, and changing our behavior is what is needed. But the question is, how did we arrive at this situation? We arrive at this situation because somewhere along the line, we got this impression that our economy is somehow separate from nature, that somehow we can operate outside of the realms of nature. It was around the Descartes time, around the Cartesian system, where we started to believe that somehow we can grow outside of nature itself, and we can therefore extract from nature with impunity. We can pollute with impunity and get away with it. Well, what we ended up with is a growth, yes, but a growth that is unsustainable, that has resulted in the climate calamity, which has boomeranged back to us in terms of natural capital risk. And this is where we are right now. And we are trying to figure out how to extricate ourselves from this self-inflicted calamity. So the next question is, well, what ought to be the system? If this is not the system that we're in, what is it, the correct system? Well, it's what the indigenous population already knew, our ancestors knew, and what Professor Jones was talking about, is that everything that you do is inside of nature. We don't live outside of nature. There's no substitute to nature. When our economy, our society, everything is inside. Nature is our home. We reside inside of nature. And if nature grows and thrives, we thrive. And when nature is stressed, we are stressed. After all, COVID-19 is basically a reminder to all of us that this this virus that you can hardly see in a wet market, that you can hardly observe, resulted in basically deaths of millions of people, and the losses of so much in terms of growth to the world at large. So we need to understand that we need to come back to nature, as our ancestors already knew, and we need to come back while we still have time. In the language of economics, we say, therefore, nature is macro-critical. This is just a terminology. But then the question is, okay, we should come back to nature. How do we refashion our economy in order to recognize that nature should be in center, front and center in all of this? Well, we have to start with what is it that we know about nature and our health and our economy. Here's something that very few people seem to know about. The scientists have known about it for quite a while. You find this in the IPCC reports, that we all know about the ocean, but what I'm talking about here is the open ocean, open and deep ocean, which belongs to nobody. It's that part of the ocean that's beyond the 100 miles from the territories of each country, and we refer to it as the open sea. It turns out that this open sea, the scientists have figured out, has been capturing so much carbon on behalf of humanity silently. In fact, they've estimated that in the past 200 years, the oceans have taken up over 500 gigatons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Just imagine. This is the part of the ocean that is away from everybody's territorial waters, is silently been grabbing all that carbon on behalf of humanity. Science also tells us that these microscopic organisms that float on top of the water, called phytoplankton, they do something incredible. They grab carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and return 50% of the oxygen that we breathe. So basically, every other breath that you take, you should be thanking this microscopic organism in the water. And how much carbon dioxide they grab from the atmosphere? They grab about 30% of the carbon dioxide that is produced by humans or by human activity. And if you want to really visualize how much is that, that's the work of 4 Amazon forests per year. This is what's going on in the ocean itself. Science also tells us that not only flora, if you like, but also creatures, in this case, these are cetaceans, these are the great whales. They also help to capture carbon on their body. They have to capture carbon on their body through from the way they eat. And how much carbon do they capture on their body? Roughly about 9 tons of carbon, or equivalent to 33 tons of carbon dioxide being kept out of the atmosphere on the body of a single whale. That's the work of about 1,500 trees. And they are so heavy that when they die, they sink. We call them negatively buoyant. They sink to the bottom of the ocean, and anything below 1,000 meters is sequestered for eternity. So that carbon never makes it back to the photic zone, and as a result does not go back into the atmosphere. But these whales also, like these huge whales, I'm talking about great whales, sometimes they can be as big as 110, 120, 130 feet long. They feed on something very, very small called krill. And the krill likes to eat phytoplankton directly or indirectly. So in your mind, imagine a triangle, that the base of the triangle is a whale likes to eat krill. The second arm of the triangle, the krill likes to eat phytoplankton. And now we need the third arm of the phytoplankton of the triangle, which goes from the phytoplankton back to the whale. How does that work? Well, the phytoplankton, to survive, it needs phosphorus, nitrogen, and iron. And these ingredients are found in the poop of the whale. Imagine. So those whales are very smart. They poop at the surface, causing the phytoplankton to become very, very active. And once they're very active, there's more of them, there's more krill. And there's more krill, there's more food for the whales. But for our purposes, those whales, by making the phytoplankton so active, phytoplankton grabs even more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So the whales, through how much carbon they grab on their body, and through the way they fertilize the phyto, are great allies to us in the fight against climate change. All right. Now on land, their cousins on land, these are the African forests in the Congo basin. These are not the savanna elephants. They're a bit smaller. They also turns out to be great allies in the fight against climate change. Those guys also happen to grab carbon in the forest through the way they eat, the way they forage, and the way they move around in the forest. They allow the bigger trees and the older trees to grow bigger and wider and grab even more carbon in their bodies. By how much? The delta is between 4% and between 7 and 14%, depending on the density of the elephant per square kilometer. Okay. What else does science tells us? Science tells us that not only trees grab carbon, but even what we call coastal blue carbon, salt marshes, seagrass, mangroves, kelp forests, peatland, wetlands. These are all amazing, amazing bodies that grab so much carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they fix it in their roots. But not only do they do that, they also are a great defense against flooding. And when you have healthy salt marshes or seagrass, then you also they have a positive impact on the stock of fish, because fish like to lay their eggs within the seagrass and hide from predators. And they have a positive knock-on effect on coral reefs. So what science is telling us is that nature is a living nature. I'm talking here about a regenerative nature. A living nature is incredibly valuable to us. But more importantly, the biodiversity, meaning it's not about flora, it's about flora and fauna. It's about the two of them interacting with each other. And what science is telling us is a living nature is invaluable to us humans, not only intrinsically valuable for itself, but for us. And it's the interaction of the animals and the flora, the species and the flora, the animals and the microbes and all of this, that what makes life what it is. We can also value that how valuable, in terms of dollar amounts, how valuable is nature to us? And this is what I have done with my colleagues. We asked the question, well, if the whale is capturing so much carbon on behalf of humanity, he's performing or she's performing a service to us, how much should we pay her for her service? You see, I work at the IMF, and the IMF pays me a salary for services that I provide. So how much should we pay this whale for the services of capturing carbon on behalf of humanity? Turns out that this whale also does other services, such as enhancing fish stocks, and there's also a very thriving whale watching industry. If we were to do so, we find that the value of the services of a single whale is over $2 million. We asked the same question of the elephants. If we were to pay the elephant for her carbon sequestration service, how much should we pay her? Well, a minimum of $1.75 million just for grabbing carbon on behalf of humanity. Next question was, well, here's the seagrass, and this is really a game changer because this is a report we just finished in the last 2 months for UNEP, and it's in press. Look at this. This is seagrass. Seagrass is the stuff that when people go to resorts, they complain to resorts that their feet is touching this stuff in the water. Well, this stuff in the water is incredible because this stuff in the water is gold, real gold. It's grabbing carbon on behalf of humanity. And even as the seas are rising due to climate change, the seagrass continues to grow and continues to grab carbon from the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and fix it in its roots. So when we valued it globally, this number now, by the way, when we first did it, it was $1.3 trillion. It's now over $2.3 trillion, just in carbon sequestration alone. If you want to know, if you want to value what is the flood control service value of the flood control service of the seagrass, you'd add another $2 trillion. And if you wanted to know the impact of seagrass on fish stocks, and that's science that comes from Australia, from the great scientists who are working in the Barrier Reef, Great Barrier Reef, you find that adds a few other $1 trillion to the value of seagrass to humanity for all the services that it's providing. Now, here's something about this open sea that I told you about. Imagine this. This is the open sea that belongs to nobody. This is the orphan that's grabbing carbon on behalf of all of humanity. When we valued how much carbon it has captured on behalf of humanity, you're talking about $30 trillion, just the stock of carbon sitting at the bottom of the ocean or suspended between 1,000 meters and below. So science tells us that nature is incredibly valuable, aside from its intrinsic value in terms of service to humanity. And we can value it, we can put a dollar amount to it. But you would think this should be enough for humanity to pay attention to nature. And the answer, unfortunately, it's not. The ocean, this is just an example of what I wanted to focus on the ocean because everybody focuses on land. And the oceans are at risk. They're at risk from, of course, from fragmentation in terms of its own governance. So many entities are responsible for so many things, traipsing on each other, not coordinating with each other within their own silos. It's the ocean is at risk from overfishing, from overmining. The whales themselves are at risk from ship strikes, sonar testing, seismic testing, from being caught in nets, and from, of course, from pollution, especially plastic pollution. So nature is not doing too great, despite the fact that science tells us how important it is to us, despite the fact that we can put a dollar amount of how important it is. So the question is, what is missing? What is missing is the legal framing. Okay, that's what's been missing all along from changing our attitude and our behavior towards nature. How do we protect nature? When something is valuable, you need to protect it. The question is, how are you going to protect nature? There are issues around the legal rights of nature. A lot of people are working about what ought to be the legal rights of nature. Some advocate that nature should be, we should confer personhood on nature, which means it's a person just like you and me. Some people want to criminalize any damages to nature, and this is the group called Stop Ecocide. And finance people think that it's enough to think of nature as an asset that has future value. If you'd like to give you examples of efforts globally on this, this is coming from Chile. Chile just is in the process of designing their new constitution. And I saw a draft of Article 9, and I don't have space to put it all here, but basically Article 9 is saying nature has rights. But New Zealand is way ahead of everybody else. They've conferred personhood on rivers, which is really incredible. That means a river is a person just like you and me, and we have obligations, it has rights, and we have obligations towards it. Another example comes, if you like, from Costa Rica. They've conferred personhood on bees, right? So once you have the science, we can do the valuation, which allows us to put a dollar amount on the value of the services, that allows us to engage the financial sector, allows us to engage policymakers, but that's still is not enough. We need action on the legal side. We need those three pillars together. Once we do that, then what happens is nature becomes, for us, we start to talk about something called natural assets, if you like. Some people like to think of it as natural capital. It becomes natural capital once you have a value to it, and then you endow it with its own legal rights. It becomes a financial capital, and the services of it, which enters the balance sheet. Just want to show you what you can do with that. So people ask me, can we build markets around nature? And I said, of course you can. Nature is providing the service, and we can get people to pay a price for that service. So what would that service be? Well, in the case of climate, since we're all talking about climate change, we need to sequester carbon from the atmosphere. All right, so who wants to sequester carbon from the atmosphere? Everybody, all these companies and countries that have committed to carbon zero, carbon negative, carbon neutral are trying to figure out how to sequester carbon from the atmosphere. So who would buy the services of nature? It could be households that want to offset their carbon footprint. It could be the industry, could be the financial sector. They pay money to purchase basically the services, not the assets themselves, never the assets themselves. It's like you're paying, if you like, the whale or the elephant or the seagrass a wage for their services. And that money goes to look after nature in perpetuity. And the money goes also to look after not only nature itself, but those that look after nature and the stewards of nature, who would be the local and indigenous populations that are there. And we can use, if you like, latest technologies to ensure there's transparency and verifiability. We can use enterprise blockchain, we can use sensors. So we have the technology now to be able to ascertain what's really going on, stuff that we did not have a number of years ago. Now, once you do all of that, notice what happens. You arrive at something I call the win-win-win model. When you create these markets around nature that are for nature, who benefits from it? Well, nature itself, because the flow of funds comes in to look after nature in perpetuity. The sellers, in this case of the carbon service, could be the indigenous populations themselves. So they get sustainable income, they get meaningful employment, which enhances their resilience and allows them to stabilize on their land. The governments where those natural capital is sitting could benefit from the additional revenue that comes in. And of course, the buyers of the carbon credits, for example, could be Microsoft, could be Google, could be all these big companies want to offset their carbon footprint. They get to reduce their carbon footprint, which makes them look good to their customers. And they also get to satisfy the ESGs, and they get to satisfy the SDGs. So the seller wins, the buyer, the seller of the service wins, the buyer wins, and the environment wins. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really fantastic. We have a lot of questions, but not a lot of time. So let me ask you one question that came up is, you mentioned that people often ignore the role and impacts to the ocean. Do you think this needs to be prioritized more amongst governments? But what are the challenges in doing that, because the ocean does not necessarily belong to any one country?
So in what people tend to forget, and although we learned that when we go to primary school, I guess, is that the ocean is 4/5 of the planet. And we only exist on 1/5 of the planet. And even if you were to plant all the trees in the world on this 1/5 of the planet, you will not make a dent in what is needed in order to grab all that carbon from the atmosphere. So the ocean remains the greatest carbon sink that we have. But the ocean itself is now becoming a victim of our own activity. So when we talk about the coastal side, the first 100 miles, those belong to the countries. So each country claims about 100 miles in its sort of aquatic zone. But when I'm also talking about the open ocean, which is beyond the 100 miles, this is the orphan. And what the scientists, and this is, I took that from the IPCC reports, the scientists have been able to document that that open ocean is the greatest carbon sink of them all. But because it belongs to everybody, it belongs to nobody, and it's subject to abuse. There are a lot of activities now trying to mine the deep ocean, to dredge the deep ocean. And that is incredibly dangerous, because when you do that, you are pushing that carbon that is sitting at the bottom back up into the photic zone and back up into the atmosphere. So do we need action? Definitely we need action. And the question is, how are we going to care about something that belongs to nobody? And this is the, in economics, we call it the tragedy of the commons. It's only a tragedy because we don't want to act. We have the science now, we have the technology. What we're missing is the political will to come together, especially, if you read the latest IPCC reports, we have less than 7 years to deal with the issues that on the climate side. Time is not on our side. We need to come together to create governance of the open ocean, to protect the open ocean on behalf of all of humanity. Can it be done? Well, of course it can be done. It's just a matter of political will to realize that we are all facing this threat together, and no one is going to escape it.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much for taking the time. I know it's late there for you, but we really, really appreciate your wonderful talk, and we'll make sure to share the rest of the questions. We had some really good ones with you. So thank you, Dr. Chemi, for being with us.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you all. I wish you well. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Okay, so now is the time where we move into our rooms. So we posted there again the links. You should know by now if you're in the blue, green, or orange rooms. Just as a reminder, okay, so just as a reminder, so Ellie and Beck will be in the blue. I will be in the green along with Zheng Yu, and Vivian and Shannon will be in the orange. So go ahead now and move to your, so sign off from this and come back in with into your special room by color. Okay, see you there. Thank you.